Part 2. Lessons from History. Athens vs. Sparta. The final point was reached when Athenian strength attained a peak plane for all to see, and the Athenians began to encroach upon Sparta's allies. It was at this point that Sparta felt its position was no longer tolerable and decided by starting this present war to employ all energies in attacking and, if possible, destroying the power of Athens. Thucydides, History of the Peloponnesian War. It was the rise of Athens and the fear that this instilled in Sparta that made war inevitable. Thucydides, History of the Peloponnesian War. As a freshman in college, I enrolled in a course on ancient Greek. Most of that first year consisted of learning a new alphabet, vocabulary, sentence structure, and grammar. But our professor promised us that if we studied hard, by the end of the second semester we would be reading Xenophon's and Abbasis. And beyond that, he dangled a prize for those who excelled in the second year, reading Thucydides. I can still hear his enunciation, Thucydides. He spoke the name of the Athenian historian with a combination of exuberance and reverence. For Professor Laban, classical Greece represented the first great steeple of civilization. Only by mastering the original language could we learn about it from the person he deemed the father of history. While he appreciated Herodotus, our professor insisted that Thucydides was the first to focus exclusively on capturing history as it really happened. His account combines a journalist's eye for detail, a researcher's search for truth among competing accounts, and a historian's ability to identify the root causes behind complex events. Thucydides was also, as Professor Laban taught us, the pioneer of what we now call realpolitik, or realism in international relations. Since I was a budding student of world politics, I became all the more determined to claim Professor Laban's prize, which I ultimately did. Thucydides left few records of his own life. We know that he was born around the middle of the 5th century BCE and that he was a citizen of Athens, one of the two most powerful city-states of ancient Greece. We also know that he was a general who, exiled from his homeland, traveled around the Mediterranean region in the midst of a great war, a conflict that racked the ancient world, and which pitted his native Athens against the dominant power of the day, the city-state of Sparta, ultimately laying both low. Thucydides' History of the Peloponnesian War is the definitive account of this conflict, and one of the great works of Western civilization. To this day it remains a seminal text, studied and debated not only by historians and classicists, but also by military and civilian strategists at universities and war colleges around the world. As Thucydides explains in the introduction to his work, the purpose of his chronicle is to help future statesmen, soldiers, and citizens understand war so that they can avoid mistakes made by their predecessors. If my history be judged useful by those who desire an exact knowledge of the past as an aid to understanding the future, which in the course of human affairs must resemble, if it does not reflect it, I shall be content. As the original applied historian, he shared the view later captured by Winston Churchill's quip, "The longer you can look back, the farther you can look forward." From Thucydides, my second-year classmates and I learned about the long peace that preceded the great war between Athens and Sparta. We read about Athens' precious experiment in democracy and its unprecedented surge of creative achievement in every field. These ancient Greeks essentially invented philosophy, drama, architecture, sculpture, history, naval warfare, and more. What they did not create themselves, they took to heights never seen before in human history. Socrates, Plato, Sophocles, Euripides, Aristophanes, Ictinus the architect of the Parthenon, Demosthenes, and Pericles remain giants in the advance of civilization. Thucydides wrote his history so that we can understand how such remarkable states that had managed to exist peacefully for decades ultimately found themselves in a devastating war. While other observers emphasized proximate causes, Thucydides goes to the heart of the matter. As to the reasons why Sparta and Athens broke the truce, he writes, "I propose first to give an account of the causes of complaint which they had against each other and of the specific instances where their interests clashed. But," he warns, "the real reason for the war is most likely to be obscured by such arguments." Beneath these contributing factors lies a more fundamental cause, and he focuses his spotlight on it. What made war inevitable, Thucydides tells us, was the rise of Athens and the fear that this instilled in Sparta. This is the phenomenon that I have labeled Thucydides' trap, the severe structural stress caused when a rising power threatens to upend a ruling one. In such conditions, not just extraordinary, unexpected events, but even ordinary flashpoints of foreign affairs, can trigger large-scale conflict. How this dynamic drove Athens and Sparta to war emerges clearly in Thucydides' account. Having combined arms in a great war to expel the Persians, he writes, Athens and Sparta set out to manage their strategic competition peacefully. They successfully resolved a series of crises that threatened to ignite war, including negotiating a grand 30 years peace. They recognized that striking differences between the two states' cultures, political systems, and interests made vigorous competition unavoidable. But they also knew that war could bring disaster and were determined to find a way to secure their interests without it. How, then, did these two great Greek city-states succumb to a conflict that had such catastrophic consequences for both? Every one of the 600 pages in the history of the Peloponnesian War offers compelling details about the twists and turns along the path of this fatal war. Stories about diplomatic encounters between the two principal and lesser Greek states like Milos, Megara, Corcyra, and many others offer instructive clues for statecraft. But Thucydides' main storyline is the gravitational force that pulled Athens and Sparta toward their collision. The relentless rise of Athens and Sparta's growing sense that this was undermining its position of predominance in Greece. His main subject, in other words, is Thucydides' Trap, and the way it ensnared the ancient world's two most fabled powers despite their repeated attempts to avoid it. Rise meets rule. Before the Persian invasion of Greece in 490 BC, Sparta had been the region's dominant power for more than a century. A city-state in the southern part of the Greek peninsula known as the Peloponnese, Sparta had to contend with several mid-sized powers on its land borders, as well as a restive slave population known as the Helots, which outnumbered Spartan citizens 7-1. Sparta remains today a symbol of the ultimate military culture. From its families to its government, the organizing principle of the entire society aimed to maximize the vitality and strength of its fighting force. Spartan authorities allowed only physically perfect infants to live. They took sons from their families at the age of 7 and enrolled them in military academies, where they were toughened, trained, and groomed for war. Men could marry at 20 but had to continue living in barracks, eating communal meals, and training daily. Only at age 30, after 23 years of service to the Spartan state, did they earn full citizenship and the right to participate in the assembly, which unlike its Athenian counterpart was dominated by conservative, aristocratic elders. Not until 60 were they finally exempt from military service. Spartan citizens prized military values above all else: courage, valor, and discipline. As Plutarch tells us, when Spartan mothers sent their sons off to war, they told them to come back bearing your shield or on it. Athens, by contrast, was a port city on a dry and bare promontory of Attica that took pride in its culture. Isolated from the rest of mainland Greece by high and sparsely populated mountains, Athens had always been a trading nation, supplied by the merchants who crisscrossed the Aegean Sea selling olive oil and timber, textiles, and precious stones. Unlike Sparta's garrison state, Athens was an open society, its academies enrolling students from across Greece. And after centuries of rule by strawmen, Athens had also begun a bold, new political experiment in what it called democracy. Its assembly and the Council of 500 were open to all free men and made all key decisions. Prior to the 5th century BCE, the Greek world was largely disconnected, divided into self-governing city-states. But the Persian invasion in 490 BC forced the Greeks to come together as never before to meet a common threat. Later, at Thermopylae, a legendary suicide force of 300 elite Spartan warriors held off an entire Persian army, sacrificing their lives to buy time for the combined Greek forces. At Salamis, an allied fleet under Athenian command brilliantly destroyed a Persian fleet despite being outnumbered 3-1. In 479 BCE, the combined Greek forces decisively defeated the invading Persian army for the second time, and this time for good. Conscious that it had played a pivotal role in the Greek victory, Athens aspired to take its place as one of the leading powers of Greece. And indeed, in the wake of the Persian retreat, the city-state experienced a remarkable economic, military, and cultural renaissance. Its economy drew traders and sailors from across the Hellenic world to serve in its merchant marine. As the volume of trade grew, Athens added a fleet of trading ships to supplement its professional navy, which was already more than twice the size of that of its nearest rival. Distant Corcyra was the only other Greek state with a substantial fleet, followed by Sparta's key ally, Corinth. Neither power posed a real danger, however, for the Athenian stunning victories in the Persian wars had proved that the skill of its sailors was even more important than the size of its fleet. Over the course of the 5th century, Athens progressively turned the defensive alliance network it had formed to fight the Persians into a de facto maritime empire. Athens demanded that allies bear their share of the burden, brutally suppressing states such as Naxos that tried to escape its clutches. By 440 BCE, all Athenian colonies except the remote Lesbos and Chios had given up their own navies and were paying Athens for protection instead. Athens then massively expanded its maritime trade links throughout the region, creating a trading regime that left many smaller Greek states more prosperous and interconnected than ever before. Flush with gold, the Athenian government funded a cultural surge that built structures unlike any ever seen before the Parthenon, for example, and staged frequent productions of the plays of Sophocles. Even as other parts of Greece looked on with growing resentment, Athenians saw the expansion of their empire as utterly benign. That empire we acquired not by violence, they later claimed to the Spartans, but instead because the allies attached themselves to us and spontaneously asked us to assume the command. The Spartans scoffed at this pretense. They knew the Athenians to be as ruthless and deceitful as they were. But their mistrust also reflected the stark contrast between the two powers' concepts of politics and culture. Sparta had a mixed political system that blended monarchy and oligarchy. It rarely intervened in the affairs of faraway nations, focusing instead on preventing a Helot rebellion at home and on securing its regional predominance. Spartans were proud of their distinctive culture, but unlike the Athenians, they did not seek to persuade other states to follow their model. Despite its imposing infantry, Sparta was a conservative, status quo power. As the Corinthian ambassador later put it to the Spartan assembly, the Athenians are addicted to innovation, and their designs are characterized by swiftness alike in conception and execution. You preserve what you have, invent nothing, and when forced to act you never go far enough. The Corinthians' caricature only slightly exaggerates. Athens projected audacity in every aspect of its national life. Athenians believed that they were advancing the frontiers of human achievement. They had no reservations about interfering in the affairs of other states, toppling oligarchic governments across the Greek islands and promoting democracies. They repeatedly sought to persuade neutral states, for example, Corcyra, to join in alliance. Most disconcertingly to Sparta, Athens's ambitions appeared to have no limit. As an Athenian diplomat stated bluntly to the Spartan assembly shortly before the onset of war, "It was not we who set the example, for it has always been the law that the weaker should be subject to the stronger." Shortly after the Persian retreat, in an attempt to remind the Greek world of its overall dominance, the Spartan leadership had demanded that the Athenians not rebuild their city walls. This would have meant deliberately leaving themselves vulnerable to a land invasion, and thus to punishment by Sparta if they dared to disobey its commands. But Athens had no intention of returning to the status quo. Athenians believed that their painful sacrifices in the fight against the Persians had earned them a degree of autonomy. In this refusal, however, Spartan leaders saw evidence of disrespect. Others saw even more ominous signs of imperial ambitions that would threaten the established order. For the moment, Athens' growing military power posed no material threat to Sparta. Together with its allied forces, the Spartans outnumbered the Athenian army by more than 2-1. Most Spartans were confident in their confederation's position as the undisputed military hegemon of Greece. Nonetheless, as Athens' power continued to increase, some proposed a preemptive attack on Athens to remind the entire Greek world who was number one. These Spartan leaders reasoned that allowing Athens to rise unimpeded would eventually jeopardize Spartan hegemony. Although the assembly overruled their initial appeals for war, as Athens' power grew, so did the influence of Spartan hawks. For a time, Spartans continued to believe that diplomacy could restrain Athens' climb. After nearly sliding into all-out conflict in the middle of the century, a series of clashes collectively known as the First Peloponnesian War, the two powers formalized their relations by a major treaty in 446 BCE. This famed 30 Years' peace laid the groundwork for a sophisticated regional security order. It prohibited members of one alliance from defecting to join the other, and established rules and a process for binding arbitration and non-interference, establishing precedents that are still used today to resolve disputes among nations. In the period that followed, Athens and Sparta agreed to settle their disputes through bilateral negotiation, and when that was not successful, with binding arbitration by a neutral party, such as the Oracle at Delphi. And while the agreement recognized Athens as an equal party, Spartans could also take comfort that its loyal allies Corinth, Thebes, and Megara, key members of the Peloponnesian League under Spartan control, were all located on Athens' doorstep. For both states, the fruits of peace were as sweet as those of war were bitter. The treaty allowed Sparta and Athens to concentrate on their own spheres. Sparta retrenched and strengthened long-standing alliances with its neighbors. Athens continued to use its powerful navy to dominate and extract gold from its own subjects throughout the Aegean. It amassed a strategic reserve amounting to the previously unheard-of sum of 6,000 talents of gold, and was adding 1,000 talents per year in revenue. Even Sparta, with its famously stoic and conservative society, experienced its own, albeit smaller, cultural renaissance. This framework provided a period of unprecedented harmony within the greater Hellenic world, extending from the Côte d'Azur to the Black Sea. But the 30 Years' peace did not resolve the underlying causes of tension. It merely put them on hold. And under these conditions, As Thucydides tells us, it took very little to set the pyre alight. The spark came in 435 BCE. Initially, a local conflict did not appear to have much impact on Athenian interests. Corinth, an important Spartan ally, had provoked a showdown with Corcyra, a neutral power, over Epidamnus, a remote settlement in modern-day Albania. Corcyra initially seemed to have the upper hand. Its fleet of 120 warships routed Corinth in their first confrontation. But the humiliated Corinthians immediately began to prepare for a second campaign. They rapidly expanded their navy, recruiting sailors from all over Greece, and soon amassed an allied force of 150 ships. While it was still no match for Athens, Corinth now commanded the second-largest fleet in Greece. Terrified, neutral Corcyra appealed to Athens for help. Corinth's actions in far-off Epidamnus now stirred fears about Sparta's malicious intentions and posed a strategic dilemma for Athens. The Athenians had two equally bad options. Aiding Corcyra directly would antagonize Corinth and potentially violate the 30 Years' Peace. But doing nothing risked allowing Corinth to commandeer the Corcyraean fleet, tipping naval power dangerously in Sparta's direction. The mood in the Athenian assembly was grave. Athenians listened carefully as Corinthian and Corcyraean diplomats presented their respective cases. The debate stretched on for 2 days until Pericles, described by Thucydides as Athens's first citizen, proposed a compromise solution. Athens would send a small, symbolic fleet to Corcyra with a directive not to engage unless attacked. Unfortunately, this attempt at a defensive deterrent proved too little to deter, but large enough to provoke. The Corinthians were enraged that the Athenians had taken up arms against them. Sparta faced a similar strategic bind. If it supported Corinth's attack against Corcyra, Athens could reasonably conclude that Sparta aimed to match its naval capabilities and might be preparing for a preemptive war. On the other hand, if Sparta remained neutral, it would risk allowing Athens to become the decisive actor in the conflict and undermine Sparta's credibility with its other Peloponnesian League allies. This crossed a red line for Sparta, since maintaining stability in its immediate neighborhood was essential to the Spartan strategy for keeping the Helot threat in check. Sparta and Athens were also at odds over another Spartan ally, Megara. In 432, Pericles had issued the Megarian Decree, an early instance of economic warfare that imposed sanctions on Megara as punishment for dishonoring Athenian temples and harboring runaway Athenian slaves. Though technically legal under its treaty with Sparta, the Megarian Decree was nonetheless provocative, and read by the Spartans as yet another sign of disrespect to the system over which Sparta presided. When Sparta demanded that Athens repeal the Megarian Decree, Pericles saw this as a challenge to his own credibility. Backing down would embolden Sparta to thwart Athens' rise elsewhere in the Greek world. It would also infuriate many Athenian citizens who saw the decree as a national prerogative. The Spartan king Archidamus Roman II and Pericles were personal friends. Archidamus could see the situation from the Athenian point of view, and he recognized that his people were moved more by emotion than reason. Appealing to the Spartan virtue of moderation, Archidamus urged the Spartan assembly not to demonize the Athenians or underestimate the Spartan government's response. We always base our preparation against an enemy on the assumption that his plans are good. But Sparta's hawks disagreed. They argued that Athens had become so arrogant that it posed an unacceptable danger to Spartan security. They reminded the assembly of Athens' frequent interventions in other Greek states, from Naxos and Potidaea to the present crises in Megara and Corcyra, and appealed to the audience's fear that Sparta's alliances were crumbling. And they demanded a harsh response, asserting that Athens deserved double punishment for having ceased to be good and for having become bad. Sparta's pro-war faction had the simpler case, and its argument was reinforced by the Corinthian ambassador. Addressing the Spartan assembly, he blamed Sparta's complacence for Athens' unchecked surge. For all this you are responsible. You it was who first allowed them to fortify their city. You alone wait till the power of an enemy is becoming twice its original size, instead of crushing it in its infancy. When the Corinthians suggested that they would withdraw from the alliance if Sparta did not act, every Spartan present must have been shocked and horrified. The message was clear: the rise of Athens could destroy a key alliance that for centuries had helped keep the Spartan homeland secure. After vigorous debate, the Spartan assembly voted for war. As Thucydides explains, the Spartans voted that war should be declared because they were afraid of the further growth of Athenian power, seeing, as they did, that already the greater part of Greece was under the control of Athens. The validity of Sparta's fears was by now irrelevant. The bulk of its leaders were convinced that Athens' aggrandizement threatened their power and security, and there was little that anyone, even their own king, could do to persuade them otherwise. Why did the Athenians not anticipate how the Spartans would react? Thucydides himself cannot explain why Pericles failed to find a way to prevent conflicts over Megara and Corcyra from leading Athens into war with Sparta. But the history of international relations in the years since offer clues. When states repeatedly fail to act in what appears to be their true national interest, it is often because their policies reflect necessary compromises among parties within their government rather than a single coherent vision. Although Pericles had been re-elected many times, he had few formal powers. The Athenian legal system was deliberately designed to limit the power of any single individual in order to avoid the risk of tyranny. Pericles was therefore as much a politician as a statesman. His influence was limited to his power to persuade. While the Megarian decree clearly had caused relations with Sparta to reach a boiling point, Pericles saw the sanctions not as a provocation, but as a necessary compromise. Backing down was a non-starter. With that Athenian populace unwilling to bow to Spartan demands, Pericles concluded that repealing the decree might be even more dangerous than standing by it. If, after he met its demand, Sparta declared war anyway, Athens would then be disgraced as well as disadvantaged. So Pericles bent to popular pressure and reluctantly drew up plans for war. Neither side had a clear military advantage, but both were fatally overconfident about their own capabilities. Having not suffered a military defeat in recent memory, the Spartans failed to understand the extent of Athenian naval power. One speaker later argued to the Spartan assembly that its soldiers could quickly starve out the Athenians by burning their fields and storehouses, ignoring the fact that the Athenian fleet could resupply the city by sea. Meanwhile, the Athenian government, which had spent decades stockpiling gold, firmly believed that it held the winning hand. Pericles calculated that Athens could hold out for 3 years against an enemy siege if necessary, more than enough time, he thought, to defeat Sparta, perhaps by inciting a Helot rebellion. Of all the observers, only Spartan king Archidamus proved prescient, predicting that neither side held a decisive advantage and that a war between them would last for a generation. The war proved as devastating as Archidamus predicted. 3 decades of bloodshed between Athens and Sparta brought the golden age of Greek culture to an end. The order that had developed after the Persian Wars, based on agreed constraints and reinforced by a balance of power, collapsed, flinging the Greek city-states into levels of violence even their playwrights had not previously been able to imagine. When they captured Melos, for example, Athenian soldiers slaughtered all the adult males and sent the women and children into slavery, a violation of the rules of combat that Greeks had observed for centuries. This episode is immortalized in Thucydides' Melian dialogue, where the Athenian ambassador captured the essence of realpolitik. We shall not trouble you with specious pretenses, either how we have a right to our empire, because we overthrew the Mede, or are now attacking you because of the wrong you have done us, he explained. Instead, you know as well as we do that right is a question that only has meaning in relations between equals in power. In the real world, the strong do what they will and the weak suffer what they must. Most notably, the war sounded the death knell of the Athenian Empire. Sparta emerged from the war victorious, but sapped of its strength, its alliance network damaged and its wealth greatly depleted. Not for another 2,000 years would the Greeks unite again of their own volition. The Peloponnesian War and the original instance of Thucydides' Trap was thus a watershed, not only in Greek history, but also in the annals of Western civilization. Was war inevitable? Why did the competition between Greece's 2 great powers ultimately produce a war that destroyed what each cherished most? According to Thucydides, the fundamental explanation lies in the depth of the structural stress between a rising and a ruling power. As this rivalry led Athens and Sparta into successive standoffs, the most passionate voices in each political system grew louder, their sense of pride stronger, their claims about threats posed by the adversary more pointed, and their challenge to leaders who sought to keep the peace more severe. Thucydides identifies 3 primary drivers fueling this dynamic that lead to war: interests, fear, and honor. National interests are plain enough. The survival of the state, and its sovereignty in making decisions in its domain free from coercion from others, are standard fare in discussions of national security. As Athens' relentless expansion began to encroach upon Sparta's allies, Thucydides explains, Sparta felt its position was no longer tolerable and thus had no alternative but war. Fear is Thucydides' one-word reminder that facts about structural realities are not the whole story. Objective conditions have to be perceived by human beings, and the lenses through which we see them are influenced by emotions. In particular, ruling powers' fears often fuel misperceptions and exaggerate dangers, as rising power's self-confidence stimulates unrealistic expectations about what is possible and encourages risk-taking. But beyond interests and perceptions lies a third ingredient Thucydides calls honor. To many modern ears the word sounds pretentious. But Thucydides' concept encompasses what we now think of as a state's sense of itself, its convictions about the recognition and respect it is due, and its pride. As Athens' power grew over the 5th century, so too did its sense of entitlement. When approached by lesser Greek states like Megara and Corinth, the fact that they were allies of Sparta did not excuse them from showing proper deference. In the great historian's telling, as these three factors became increasingly intertwined, they produced repeated face-offs Athens and Sparta could not avoid. Despite their best efforts to prevent conflict, the leaders of the two states could not stop a relentless realignment from tipping into bloodshed. While each was playing chess against the other, at the same time, each was also contending with domestic political constituents who increasingly believed that failing to stand up to the other would be both dishonorable and disastrous. Ultimately, the leaders of Athens and Sparta were overwhelmed by their own domestic politics. Pericles and Archidamus understood the insight that America's greatest presidential scholar Richard Neustadt summarized in characterizing the American presidency. Weakness, he observed, remains the word from which to start. Was Thucydides right in claiming that the rise of Athens made war inevitable? Not literally, of course. His point was that as Athens grew more powerful and Sparta grew more anxious, the two countries chose paths that made it increasingly difficult to avoid war. As the stakes rose, Athenian assertiveness swelled into hubris. Spartan insecurity festered into paranoia. By forbidding interference in the other power's sphere of influence, the peace treaty unintentionally accelerated Athenian and Spartan competition over the remaining neutral states. Proximate crises in Corcyra and Megara brought to a head pressures that had been building for decades. Thus Thucydides' trap claimed its first victims. In spite of great statesmen and wise voices in both Athens and Sparta warning that war would mean disaster, the shifting balance of power led both sides to conclude that violence was the least bad option available. And the war came.